Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, incredibly rapid shift that's currently underway in Canadian digital policy. Now, if you've been keeping an eye on the news lately, you've probably noticed a real flurry of new bills and regulations. But what you might not realize, and what's absolutely crucial here, is that this isn't happening in isolation. Canada is actually directly mirroring a regulatory blueprint recently laid out by the European Union. We are talking about a complete overhaul of how we interact with the digital world.
And looking at all this, it really begs a fascinating, profound question. What actually happens when the open internet is fundamentally re-architected across entire continents? Because we are just tweaking a few rules here. We're talking about a scale of legislative change that literally touches everything, from how you log in, to who gets to store your data, to how your very identity is proven online.
Honestly, the stakes could not be higher. Udbhav Tiwari, the Vice President of Strategy and Global Affairs over at Signal, put it pretty bluntly. He said, "We would rather pull out of the country than be compelled to compromise on the privacy promises we have made to our users." Think about that. When major global tech platforms are straight up threatening a full exodus, you know for sure that the structural changes on the table are absolutely monumental.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap to make sense of this geopolitical shift. We've got 1. The transatlantic digital shift. 2. Age verification for all. 3. Expanding digital surveillance. 4. The digital ID push. And finally, 5. A new internet era. Section 1. The transatlantic digital shift. So take a look at this OECD mapping exercise. It brilliantly illustrates that these nations absolutely aren't operating in silos. Canada, the EU, the UK, the US, they're all actively mapping out global digital policy frameworks together. They're sharing standards and actively aligning their legal architectures to create what is essentially a unified global approach to the internet. All right, moving to Section 2, age verification for all. In Canada, this heavy push is primarily being driven by Bills S210 and C34. You probably know the latter as the Digital Safety Act. These bills specifically target pornographic websites and major social media platforms. C34, for instance, goes as far as imposing a social media ban for any user under 16. And how do they plan to enforce this? Well, platforms would be required to use third-party age assurance tech. If they refuse to comply, they're looking at massive fines. We're talking up to $10 million or 3% of their global revenue. Now, supporters argue this is just a much-needed common-sense step to protect kids from online harms. But on the flip side, critics and privacy advocates are sounding the alarm, warning that this essentially spells the end of online anonymity. To really understand those fears, we have to look at what age assurance actually means in practice. It generally falls into two camps: age verification, which means you have to physically upload an official government ID, or age estimation, which relies on facial scanning technologies. And the core technical debate boils down to this. Right now, there is simply no way to keep a 15-year-old off a platform without also verifying the age of a 45-year-old. So a rule that's aimed at protecting a minority of young users effectively snowballs into mandated sweeping identity checks for the entire adult population. And this brilliantly illustrates a key point. Canada isn't just inventing this approach out of thin air. They're marrying it. Over in Europe, the EU's Digital Services Act and the UK's Ofcom mandates are already enforcing these exact types of age-gating requirements. Canada's Digital Safety Act is simply taking that European and British blueprint, bringing it across the ocean, and standardizing this regulatory approach to age online. Which brings us to Section 3, expanding digital surveillance. The absolute centerpiece here is Canada's Bill C-22, the Lawful Access Act. This bill introduces a structural change that is frankly massive. It mandates that a really broad, somewhat ill-defined category of electronic service providers has to retain user metadata for up to a full year. On top of that, it requires these platforms to literally build backdoor extraction capabilities for state and law enforcement agencies. And maybe most notably, it lowers the evidentiary threshold to get that data down to just reasonable grounds to suspect. For context, that is the lowest investigative threshold in Canadian criminal law. The government's stance is that this simply modernizes criminal investigations for the digital age, while civil liberties groups are out there warning that it lays down the architecture for unprecedented mass surveillance. So the crucial point is, how do these new laws actually collide with the technology we use? Well, privacy-focused platforms like Signal rely heavily on end-to-end encryption. They literally cannot comply with mandatory extraction backdoors without completely breaking their own product. Same goes for VPNs like Windscribe and NordVPN, which operate on strict no-log policies.
A legal mandate telling them to retain a year of user metadata fundamentally contradicts the court architecture of what they do. And that is exactly why we're seeing these companies threaten to pack up and leave the Canadian market entirely. Now, what's really interesting here is the pushback. While Canada is currently pushing hard for this metadata retention, we can actually look to Europe to see how this might play out in the courts. The European Court of Justice has previously struck down very similar sweeping metadata retention architectures, ruling that they were unconstitutional and violated privacy rights. So Canada is essentially trying to implement a surveillance framework that its European allies have already battled over legally and, in many cases, entirely rejected. Okay, Section 4, the digital ID push. Right now, Canada's approach to digital identity is, well, it's pretty fragmented. It's governed by the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, but the actual implementation relies on these decentralized provincial systems that are still very much in development. The ultimate goal here, which is being supported by data governance modernization in bills like C-27, is seamless public-private interoperability. The big promise is totally frictionless economic services and convenience. But of course, that's being weighed against some deep public skepticism when it comes to data sovereignty and the potential for government tracking. But once again, we see that blueprint alignment. The EU is currently in the process of rolling out its comprehensive European Digital Identity Wallet. And wouldn't you know it, Canada's Pan-Canadian Trust Framework is structurally designed to mirror those exact standards. The objective isn't just to have a standalone national ID, it's international interoperability. They want it so that your Canadian digital credentials would be instantly readable and accepted by a European system, and vice versa. Let's move to and see how this builds from just an abstract theory into actual binding policy. Take the December 2025 Transatlantic Pact. We see the formation of the EU-Canada Digital Partnership Council. They signed an official Memorandum of Understanding that's specifically dedicated to digital credentials and identity wallets. They have formally committed to joint testing and pilot projects, and they share an explicitly stated ultimate goal, the mutual recognition of digital IDs. Canada and the EU are literally legally locking themselves into a shared digital identity future. And finally, Section 5. A new internet era. When you zoom out and look at the big picture, it's like a giant puzzle, and the pieces just snap together perfectly. Whether we're looking at the push for mandatory age verification, the massive expansion of metadata retention and lawful access, or these formal agreements to interlock digital identity wallets, the trend is undeniable. Canada is explicitly and systematically coordinating its foundational digital infrastructure with its European allies. They are effectively rewriting the rules of the internet. So I want to leave you with this final thought. As Canada tightly mirrors the EU's digital blueprint, shifting us from an era of online anonymity into one of verified identity and broad data retention, what does this actually mean for the future of your privacy? What does it mean for your security and the fundamentally open nature of the internet you use every single day? It's this massive ongoing tension between safety and privacy, and it's a debate that is going to define our digital lives for decades to come. This information is brought to you by Microdyne Computers. If you enjoy the content, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps me to better understand what you, the viewers, want to see. Thank you so much for watching.